Published work that I did in 1985. I wrote it in 1984, and a brother in a congregation out of New York. I was incarcerated at the time, and a brother and sister out of in their congregation out of New York actually published this for me in 1985. It's called Words of Liberation from Prison, and it was, as you see, it was the proudest moment of my life. At that time, you know, I was really, really excited that I had a book in print, and that while incarcerated, I was able to accomplish that, and that someone was interested enough in hearing what I had to say, even though I was confined at the United States Penitentiary in Lewisburg. But this was the first book that I actually ever had published. That was in 1985. 10 years later, a decade later, this book came out on October 1st, 1995. Anybody have any idea what happened on October 1st, 1995? October 1st, 1995. The Million Man March. I started working on this collection that eventually ended up being a book. I was doing a series of lectures on the East Coast on this particular subject, the African American Christian Nation, and I was in a little town called Farmville, North Carolina, and a group of college kids from the North Carolina Central University in Durham had gathered at one of their former professors' home. And I went there in the home, it was a spacious home, and did the lecture. And of course, being a college student, after the lecture, he wanted to see my notes. And I said to him, well, my notes wouldn't make any sense to you, young man, but what I would do is when I get back to Ohio, I would type the notes out and I would send them to you. And of course, in the process of typing the notes out, it started to make sense to me. And so, that produced the African American Christian Nation. My timing was a little unfortunate because it came out on the day of the Million Man March, and so it appeared that I had copied from the Nation of Islam and the Million Man March, and I was trying to capitalize on something that somebody else had done, and that I was now trying to create a Christian version of the Nation of Islam. And so I took undue criticism from the people who said I was trying to take everybody back to the 1960s with the Black Power movement. So it was ill timing, but this was my second work. This was the second work that actually reached print. I was a little discouraged by the reception that I got after that. And so it took me 5 more years before I came out with another work. And this was a collaboration with Chris Broussard, who I made famous. You can tell him. He was writing for the Akron Beacon-Journal at the time, and I picked him up and chose him to be my co-writer. Of course, after that, he got promoted to be to cover the New York Times, to cover the Knicks for the New York Times. He went from there to cover the NBA for the New York Times, and from there he got on ESPN, and now I can't reach him. No, I still do. But that was a work that took us actually 2 years to produce. We started working on that in 1998, and he got those promotions in between that time. But he first started with me in 1997, and I had a cable show. And I used to let him come on my cable show. so whenever we were together, I just let him know that I'm the one that groomed you for TV. And so I think I still have some of those old video, but I don't think we would call them videos back then. I think they were some kind of tape beta or some kind of tape beta. Oh my God. So I probably can't do anything with them if I can locate it. But that's part of the process that we have to go through to bring about change. Now fast forward 15 years. to the Baedeker to nationhood, and that's what we're gathering here today for to talk about the Baedeker to nationhood. So we go from 1985 and the 20th century to 2015 and the 21st century. And now we're talking about a span of time from 1982, when I first started this collection of sermons, from 1982 to 2015. So now we're talking, oh wow, 30 plus years. We're talking about 30 plus years and the evolution to where we come to the term the Baedeker to nationhood. The most obvious question that I have, and that I have to feel most of the time, is what is Baedeker? Baedeker actually comes from a German journalist who wrote travel guides for people moving about Germany in the 19th century. He lived from 1801 to 1859. And of course, by the time it was translated from German to English, it went from meaning sign to guideposts, designation, and signs. And so now we have, if you remove Baedeker and place the English translation, we have the guidepost, the guide sign, the indicator to nationhood. And so that's what I was, the essence that I was capturing in this work, the Baedeker to nationhood. How do we move through the guideposts? Where is the guideposts? Where are the indicators? Where are the signs that lead us to nationhood? Now, to those who were skeptical about my 1995 work, which is no longer available, not because of the criticism, but because I went back. I always take criticism personally. Not personally in the sense that I'm angry or bitter, but there were some legitimate concerns that they had, and then I realized that I had not captured well enough in this work. And then as I reviewed it, like anyone else, you add 20 years to it, and I've grown since then. What I believe are my basic foundational concepts for nationhood are the same, but how you express that to others and what it really means to have a nation and be a nation, I've grown. Add to that my life experiences. If you ask me today about a political campaign, I can speak as a political consultant because of my experiences in the field. If you had asked me that in 1995, I could have given you my high school civic explanation because I had no real experience with campaign, managing campaign. Well, since that time, when you get a chance, you can see that there's a work now, how to conduct a winning issue campaign based on the campaigns that I've been involved in, based on the real experiences. Another key question is, what is a nation? The overwhelming concept of a nation, or how you build a nation, starts with one army defeating another army, or capturing another land or territory and setting your flag in the ground and declaring that you are now in control. You have subdued someone. And that's not the definition of a nation. There are basically 6 concepts to being a nation. First of all, you have to be stable. People have to be stable. Second, there has to be a distinct culture. Third, there has to be a common language. Fourth, you have to have a territory. 5, you have to have an economic life. 6, you have to be able to converse that into not just a geographical area, but you have to have a distinct culture. And so now if we look at stable, anytime people are chaotic and confused, it's called divide and conquer. So the Baedeker to nationhood leads you to on a guide to unity. And so in order to be stable, then we have to put some basic things in place. In order for us to be stable, there has to be some protection. Well, that's where the army comes in and everybody gets confused. Oh, we must have this powerful army. No, to protect means we must provide security for our women, our children, our brothers, and all our institutions. We must have some institutions. And that leads to the fact that if you don't have institutions that you control, let me say it another way, if you don't have industries that you control, if you don't have commodities that you control, you can never set the price on anything. And if you can never set the price on something, you will always be a consumer. Jerry Rawlings, who was an African president of an African nation, was upset because they produced cocoa, but he could not set the price. The European market told him what they would pay for his cocoa bean. He couldn't set the price. So even though he had the territory, he had the land, but he did not have control of his economic life. And so when we're talking about nation, you have to look at how do we build all these concepts in. So out of the 1995 book, I was able to capture something that would enable me to build for the future. You have to be stable. You have to be historically developed. If you don't know your history, you only want to repeat your failures. So you have to be historically developed. And that's one of the breaches that we have now generationally. And I like to use the terms, and when you read these materials, you're going to find a lot of new terms. That I use the term imperfect people and impoverished people rather than minority people. Because imperfect people are those who have been codified, categorized, or labeled by some arbitrary group of people who nobody knows who they are. But they set this standard that makes you imperfect if you do not measure up to this standard. And guess what? This standard is constantly changing. If we were in India, we would be part of the caste system. If you're not born into this elites, or if you were in Europe, if you were not born into the royal family, you could never ascend to that place. And so what we have with this arbitrary system in America and in the Western civilization is an elite group that nobody exactly knows who they are setting a standard for what makes you perfect. And so, since we can never measure up to the perfect standard, we are the imperfect people. And guess what? Imperfect people set the standard. So if you've ever been arrested, you're now imperfect. You can't get a job, not a decent job. You can't get decent housing because they do the background check and you keep popping up as not minority, you popping up as imperfect. Can't have you because you have these marks against you, which make you now imperfect. Whether it's a misdemeanor, whether you even can explain what happened. Well, we'll get back with you. So we become this imperfect people. We've been codified as this imperfect group. And then we're the impoverished people. Why are we impoverished? Because the same people that set the imperfect standard set the standard for when you were poor. If you don't have a certain amount of money per household, then you're below the poverty level, so you must be poor. So you're the impoverished people. Well, I grew up in rural eastern North Carolina in apartheid America. I was born in 1949, and so I've lived part of 8 different decades. I know you're counting and multiplying 8 times 10. 80. Boy, he looks good for 80. Key word I said was part of 8 decades. So that's how Ben Carson got messed up. He gave part of the truth. But anyway, because of the partial existence of 8 decades, I've seen a number of changes. Now, the 20th century, whether you acknowledge him, like him, or dismiss him, the 20th century is divided before Martin Luther King and after Martin Luther King. Doesn't matter what you think about him, the civil rights movement, or any of that, the world, the 20th century can be divided by before King and after King. The whole world changed during that period. Now, if that one single solitary life could change a century, and which I would be a part of that, then I realized that it wasn't him. It was an idea, it was a concept that started to move. And it didn't start with him. He was able to articulate it, but it had started before him with a man by the name, well, many names, but the name that's most prominent in the city that he came to was Vernon John. Dr. Vernon John was the pastor of the church that Martin Luther King came to pastor. They fired Vernon John because he spoke about justice, peace, equality, being stable, being historically developed, having your own economic life. He was talking about a nation. Those 6 elements that I just named, Vernon John said, well, don't buy from them. I got a farm out in the country, outside of Montgomery. I'll grow the vegetables, and he was bringing them in and selling the vegetables. Well, people who wanted to live up to the arbitrary standard said, we don't want our preacher wearing overalls and farming. That's our pastor. We want him to look like the other pastors. And so they got rid of Vernon John. Well, as God would have it, he had a little guy, really young, about 24, 25 at the time, and they felt like this young guy, we can really tell him what to do and shape him. And what happened? Ended up with a Montgomery bus boycott. And they said, well, we need a spokesperson. But the old guy said, no, I'm not going to jeopardize my church and make these people mad at me. Let's put the young guy in charge. You won't read this in the history book, but I can substantiate this being very, very close to being 99.9% accurate. And so Abernathy and others said, let's push the young guy out there. In case there's some backlash, he goes down. Of course, he went up. So Abernathy said, well, the best thing I should do is ride with him. I'll be the vice president. And so history has a way of unfolding that if it's not told by us, or not given the accurate account by the people who are involved, somebody else will write the history. And if somebody else is writing the history, W-R-I-T-I-N-G, writing the history, then here we come years later trying to write the history, R-I-G-H-T, because this arbitrary panel set the arbitrary standard, and that arbitrary standard didn't include us.